On April 27, 2024, 30-year-old Mica Miller drove alone to Lumber River State Park in North Carolina. Within hours, she would be dead. Her death was officially ruled a suicide. But what happened in the weeks and months before that afternoon raised questions that would spread far beyond the small stretch of the Carolinas she called home. Mica had separated from her husband, John Paul Miller, a well-known pastor in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. She had filed for separation. She had reportedly told people she was afraid, and according to federal prosecutors, investigators would later uncover a pattern of alleged harassment, stretching back more than a year, tracking devices, unwanted contact, damage to her vehicle, and conduct prosecutors say was designed to control and intimidate her. Then, more than a year and a half after Mica's death, John Paul Miller was federally indicted. But there is a crucial distinction to understand right from the start. John Paul Miller has not been charged with killing Mica. So what exactly happened between this couple? What did Mica experience in the final months of her life? And why has this case continued to draw national attention, protests, and headlines more than 2 years later? Tonight, we're laying out the timeline, the allegations, the investigation, and where the case stands right now. This is the story of Mica Miller and John Paul Miller. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel is dedicated to careful, well-sourced true crime storytelling. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Who was Mica Miller? Mica Miller was 30 years old when she died. She was married to John Paul Miller, the pastor of a Myrtle Beach church that, at the time, drew a devoted congregation. From the outside, the couple looked like a picture of family and faith, but behind the scenes, court records tell a very different story, one of a marriage that was unraveling, quietly and then not so quietly, over more than a year. In October 2023, Mica filed for divorce. That case was later dismissed. In February 2024, John Paul filed for separation of his own. That case too was dismissed without prejudice. Then in April 2024, Mica filed for separation again. A hearing was scheduled for June 5th. Mica never made it to that hearing. Just weeks later, everything changed. The allegations. As Mica's story spread online, much of the public conversation focused on what she had allegedly said about her marriage, that she was afraid, that she was trying to get out. A lot of that early information was disputed, and in the months after her death, the case became surrounded by speculation, message boards, and competing narratives. That's worth pausing on, because the internet has produced countless theories about what happened to Mica Miller. Theories are not evidence. What matters is what investigators and prosecutors actually documented, and years later, they documented quite a lot. According to a federal indictment handed down in December 2025, prosecutors allege that John Paul Miller engaged in a sustained pattern of harassment toward Mica, beginning in November 2022 and continuing until her death in April 2024. The indictment lays out several specific allegations. Prosecutors say tracking devices were placed on Mica's vehicle. They allege that an intimate photograph of her was posted online without her consent. They allege that on one occasion Miller contacted her more than 50 times in a single day. And they allege that he interfered with her finances and daily life, including, on at least one occasion, damage to her vehicle's tires. These are allegations contained in a federal indictment, not proven facts. John Paul Miller has pleaded not guilty to every charge against him. But the indictment fundamentally reshaped the public understanding of this case, turning what had largely been treated as a private tragedy into the subject of an active federal cyberstalking investigation. The final days. By April 2024, Mica's marriage was heading toward another legal confrontation. She had filed for separation. A hearing had been scheduled, and according to reports at the time, John Paul had been served with legal paperwork shortly before her death. Then came April 27th, the day Mica died. Investigators were later able to reconstruct much of her final hours through surveillance footage, receipts, license plate tracking, and a 911 call. The timeline is difficult to hear, but it's important to lay out exactly as investigators pieced it together. April 27, 2024, Mica was seen leaving her residence in Myrtle Beach that morning. She returned home briefly, then left again at approximately 11:38 a.m. At around 12:12 p.m., surveillance footage showed her entering a pawn shop. Inside, she purchased a firearm and ammunition. She left the store about 20 minutes later. Her vehicle was then tracked moving through South Carolina via surveillance and license plate recognition technology. At approximately 1:27 p.m., she stopped at a grocery store in Mullins, where she bought a drink and gas. From there, she continued north, toward Lumber River State Park in North Carolina. At approximately 2:54 p.m., Mica placed a 911 call. According to investigators, she asked whether authorities could locate her phone. She then told the dispatcher she intended to take her own life. The call ended. Authorities began searching for her almost immediately. Later that afternoon, a person on a kayak spotted a body in the water. Mica Miller was dead from a gunshot wound. The firearm recovered at the scene matched the one she had purchased earlier that day. The North Carolina medical examiner ruled her death a suicide and stated there was no indication of foul play. But for a lot of people who knew Mica, and a lot of people who had only just learned her name, the story was far from settled. If you haven't already, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button. We're about to get into the part of this case that made it a national story. Why did people question the case? Almost as soon as Mica's death was reported, questions started circulating. Why had she driven to a state park 2 hours from home? Why had she bought a gun hours before? What had actually been happening inside her marriage? Mica's family and supporters publicly raised concerns about the circumstances surrounding her death. At the same time, investigators pointed to the evidence they had collected: the surveillance footage, the 911 call, the firearm, the receipts, witness statements, and crucially, information about where John Paul Miller had been that day. Investigators determined that John Paul was not in North Carolina when Mica died. According to law enforcement, he had been in the Charleston area the day before for a sporting event and was traveling back toward Myrtle Beach on April 27th. This is one of the most important facts in this entire case, and it's worth repeating clearly. The official determination was not that Mica had been murdered. Her death was ruled a suicide, and John Paul Miller has never been charged in connection with her death itself. What the investigation did continue to examine for more than a year and a half afterward was his conduct toward her in the months and years leading up to it. The federal investigation. The case took its most significant turn in December 2025, when a federal grand jury in Columbia, South Carolina, indicted John Paul Miller. The charges were not murder. They were cyberstalking and making false statements to federal investigators. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of South Carolina, prosecutors allege that beginning in November 2022, Miller engaged in a course of conduct using electronic communications and interstate commerce that placed Mica in reasonable fear and caused her substantial emotional distress, the legal definition at the heart of the cyberstalking charge. The indictment specifically references the tracking devices, the repeated unwanted contact, the posting of an intimate photograph without consent, and the tire damage. It also alleges that Miller lied to federal investigators during their inquiry, telling them he had hired a private investigator to protect Mica from purchasing firearms, when prosecutors allege the investigator was actually hired to look into suspected infidelity. Prosecutors also allege Miller denied damaging Mica's tires, despite evidence, including an online purchase of a tire deflation device, suggesting otherwise. Again, these are allegations. The Department of Justice itself states plainly that an indictment is only an accusation and that a defendant is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. If convicted on both counts, Miller could face up to 7 years in prison and a fine of up to $250,000. John Paul Miller's response. In January 2026, John Paul Miller appeared before a federal judge in Florence, South Carolina, and pleaded not guilty to both charges. More than 70 people packed the courthouse that day, with protesters gathering outside. He was released on a $100,000 unsecured bond. The conditions were strict: an ankle monitor, no travel outside South Carolina without notice, surrender of his passport, no contact with potential witnesses or members of Mica's family, and no possession of firearms. Miller waived his right to a speedy trial, something his attorneys described as a standard defense move to allow more time to review the evidence against him. Because he has pleaded not guilty, the government's allegations still have to be proven in court. That distinction matters, and it's one that responsible true crime storytelling has to hold on to. What investigators allege and what has actually been proven in a court of law are not the same thing. The case is still developing since Miller's arraignment. The federal case has moved slowly. In March 2026, a judge approved a delay to give the defense more time with the government's discovery materials. In April, another continuance followed, this time tied to what the defense called voluminous additional evidence turned over by prosecutors. In July, the case was pushed again, this time to the September 2026 term of court. And just this week, in one of the most recent developments, the court granted yet another continuance, moving the case to the October 2026 term. A new jury selection date has not yet been set. That means, as of this video, this story is still unfolding in real time. The courtroom may eventually provide a far more detailed picture of what prosecutors say happened between November 2022 and April 2024, and it may give the public the clearest account yet of the final period of Mica's life. The questions that remain. The Mica Miller case draws so much attention because it's really two stories, woven together but not identical. The first is the story of a young woman's death, a death that a medical examiner ruled a suicide, following a documented, harrowing final afternoon, captured in surveillance footage, and a 911 call. The second is a federal criminal case against her estranged husband, a case built not around her death, but around what prosecutors allege he did to her in the years leading up to it. Those two stories overlap. They are connected by the same people, the same relationship, the same collapsing marriage. But they are not the same legal question. And treating them as though they are does a disservice to both the facts and to Mica herself. Mica's death was ruled a suicide. John Paul Miller has not been charged with causing it. But prosecutors allege that his conduct toward her amounted to a sustained pattern of cyberstalking, and that he later lied to the federal agents investigating it. He has pleaded not guilty. The case is ongoing, and the court will ultimately decide whether the government's allegations hold up. Mica Miller was 30 years old when her life ended. She left behind family, friends, and a community that is still, more than 2 years later, searching for a full accounting of what happened to her. The internet has produced no shortage of theories about this case, but the responsibility of anyone telling this story, including us, right now, is to keep suspicion, allegation, and proven fact clearly separated. John Paul Miller is facing federal charges. He has pleaded not guilty. Mica's death was ruled a suicide, and as of August 2026, the federal case remains pending, now set for the October 2026 term of court. The next major chapter in this story will likely unfold inside a federal courtroom. Until then, many questions remain. What do you think the upcoming federal case could reveal? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this investigation informative, subscribe for more carefully researched true crime documentaries, and hit the bell so you don't miss when this case updates again. And remember, sometimes the darkest part of a case isn't what we know, it's what we still don't know. This video discusses suicide. If you or someone you know is struggling, the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available 24/7 by call or text at 988.